Caitlin Clark has been grabbed, shoved, elbowed, and kneed on national television for 2 straight seasons, and the league that profits every single time she steps on the floor still hasn't figured out how to stop it from happening to her. Somewhere inside the WNBA league office, there is a number that made a head coach stop caring about getting fined. There is a foul so obvious that the league had to reverse its own referees days after the fact, and there is a data claim from inside the league itself that directly contradicts everything players have been saying in post-game interviews all season. By the end of this video, you will know all 3, and you will understand why none of it has actually protected the player the entire business is built around. Before we get into it, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is still moving, and there is more coming out of Indianapolis every single week this season. The night the number became impossible to ignore. Every officiating controversy needs a moment where a number stops being an opinion and starts being evidence. For the Indiana Fever, that number showed up after a gutting loss to the New York Liberty, a game Indiana had a real chance to win until Natasha Cloud stripped Caitlin Clark of the ball right before the final buzzer, and New York escaped with a 90-88 win. Head coach Stephanie White walked into her post-game press conference and did not soften anything. She said flatly that she thought Clark had been fouled on that final possession, and then she went further. She put a statistic on the table that turned a single bad call into a pattern. A -31 free throw differential over Indiana's recent stretch of games. Not -3, not -10, -31. White made a point of explaining why that number mattered so much. She said if the Fever were just chucking up 3-pointers all game, a free throw gap might make sense, because jump shooters don't get fouled as often as players attacking the basket. But that wasn't what was happening. Indiana was attacking the rim. They were doing the physical work that's supposed to get you to the free throw line, and it wasn't translating into whistles. The disrespect right now for our team has been pretty unbelievable, White said. She called what was happening to her team pretty egregious. Those are not throwaway words from a coach trying to fire up her locker room. Those are words picked by someone who understood she might get fined by the league for saying them and decided the fine was worth it. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. In that specific Fever Liberty game, the box score backs her up. New York shot 25 free throws to Indiana's 11. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was sitting right there in the numbers for anyone who wanted to check. And this wasn't an isolated incident that White happened to notice on a bad night. It was the tail end of a stretch that had clearly been building for weeks, which raises the obvious question. If a head coach is willing to hand the league a specific checkable statistic in a live press conference, why hasn't the problem been fixed? To answer that, you have to go back further, to the play that actually forced the league to admit something had gone wrong. The foul. The league had to take back. If the free throw numbers were the slow-building evidence, this next moment was the one that couldn't be explained away with statistics, because it happened in front of a national broadcast audience in real time. During a loose ball sequence between the Fever and the Phoenix Mercury, Alyssa Thomas made contact with Caitlin Clark's throat. In the moment, with officials watching from multiple angles, they reviewed the play and decided it wasn't even a flagrant foul, no call beyond a standard foul. Clark stayed on the floor, visibly frustrated, and the game moved on like nothing unusual had happened. Except something unusual had happened, and days later, the league quietly admitted it. The WNBA went back, reviewed the footage again away from the pressure of a live broadcast, upgraded the play to a flagrant 2, and suspended Alyssa Thomas for 1 game. Sit with the sequence of events here. In real time, with trained officials standing feet away from the play, the result was nothing. Days later, under no live pressure at all, the league concluded the exact same play deserved a suspension. That's not a case of a rule being applied differently. That's a case of the wrong answer being given first, in the moment that actually mattered for player safety, and the correct answer only showing up after the damage was already done. Clark made her frustration with officiating clear in the aftermath, and she wasn't shy about connecting it to a bigger pattern. It's kind of been a discussion for 3 years now. she told reporters, "and I think we really need to do a better job protecting the people in this league." 3 years, not 3 weeks. 3 years of this exact same conversation repeating itself. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the league specifically, because this wasn't the first time in recent memory that a no call on a dangerous play turned into a serious injury question. During last year's playoffs, a no call on contact between Napheesa Collier and Alyssa Thomas ended with Collier suffering 3 torn ligaments and a torn muscle in her leg. That moment produced the angriest, most publicized meltdown from a head coach in league history, when Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve was suspended for a game over her post-game comments about the officiating crew. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert herself admitted afterward that the league had a real problem on its hands. So, when the Alyssa Thomas foul on Clark's throat went uncalled in real time, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening after the league had already publicly acknowledged from the top that its officiating needed to change. Which brings up the next question. If the league already knew and already promised to fix it, why did the exact same failure pattern show up again with its biggest star on the receiving end? Keep that question in mind, because it's about to get more complicated, not less. Death by 1,000 technicals. While the no calls were piling up on one side of the ledger, something almost the opposite was happening on the other side. Caitlin Clark was racking up technical fouls at a pace that put her dangerously close to a suspension of her own. Under WNBA rules, a player who reaches 8 technical fouls in a season is automatically suspended for 1 game. By the end of June, Clark already had 5. One of them came during a win over the Phoenix Mercury, after she was called for a personal foul following a collision with DeWanna Bonner, and then clapped her hands while walking away. That clap was enough for a technical. "It's ridiculous. I got a technical for clapping," Clark said afterward. "We should all just go on the calendar now and pick a game that I'm going to be suspended for if I'm getting any technicals for clapping." 5 technicals meant an automatic $1,000 fine and a formal warning letter from the league. It didn't stop there. Clark picked up a 6th technical foul just 91 seconds into a game against the New York Liberty, putting her only 2 away from that automatic suspension. Head coach Stephanie White admitted the team now had to be strategic about how Clark reacted to officiating in real time, essentially coaching her to manage her own emotional response so the league wouldn't take the decision about her playing time out of their hands entirely. Think about what that actually means. The same player who is visibly repeatedly on the wrong end of physical no calls is simultaneously one bad reaction away from a suspension for reacting to those no calls. The frustration that's a completely rational response to watching contact go uncalled becomes the exact thing that could cost her a game. That's the trap. Get hit, don't get the call, show any visible frustration about it, and you're the one who ends up punished. This is where the story stops being simple. It would be easy to tell this as pure villain and victim, league versus player, and stop there. But the WNBA did actually respond to the broader criticism, and the response is worth understanding because it created a genuinely strange new problem. What the league actually built to fix. Here's something most of the loudest takes on this topic skip entirely. The WNBA didn't ignore the officiating crisis. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert publicly admitted last October that the league had a problem, and the response wasn't a press release. It was structural. The league built a dedicated officiating task force, separate from the normal competition committee, made up of some of the most prominent coaches and executives in the sport, including Stephanie White herself, Cheryl Reeve, and Becky Hammon. Monty McCutcheon, the NBA and WNBA's head of referee development and training, explained what had gone wrong in blunt terms. "We didn't meet as often with our stakeholders," he said, "and it just started to drift away, and we found ourselves with a game that was too rough. And now, we're living with the process of cleaning that up." The new standard for the 2026 season centers on something called freedom of movement, a rule emphasis meant to cut down on grabbing, holding, and off-ball physicality across the entire floor, not just around star players. Officials are now being graded through an internal review system where performance can directly affect assignments and promotions. The league even discussed building something similar to the NBA's last 2-minute report, a public accountability tool that shows fans exactly what officials got right or wrong in the closing minutes of close games. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. When the league actually tightened the whistle, fouls didn't go down. They went up, way up. Free throw attempts increased across the board. Games started running longer. And instead of players feeling more protected, a lot of them said the game felt choppier and harder to read because officials were now calling things that used to get waved off as normal basketball. The crackdown solved one problem and immediately created a new one. So the league genuinely tried to fix this. And the fix, so far, hasn't produced the clean result anyone wanted. Which means the question isn't really, did the WNBA do anything? It's, why are the players still saying the exact same thing they were saying before any of this started? The players aren't even disagreeing with each other. If this were just one frustrated star player or one outspoken coach, you could write it off as an isolated grievance. It isn't. Listen to how many different voices across the league are describing the exact same core problem, using almost identical language. Kelsey Plum said it plainly during All-Star Weekend. "I have no problem with the physicality," she said. "I think people are getting frustrated at consistency. Not too much contact, not too little. Inconsistency." Natasha Cloud, who was suspended last season after racking up 7 technical fouls, 3 of which she believes should have been rescinded, described feeling dismissed whenever players try to raise these issues directly with officials. "I constantly feel like we're being made to be like babies or complainers," she said. Mystics guard Brittany Sykes framed it as a trust problem. "People make mistakes," she said. "But if we keep making the same mistakes, we're forced to feel as if the mistakes that are happening are choices we make." Read that sentence again. A player is saying that repeated errors, without correction, start to look less like human error and more like intent, whether or not that's actually true. Aces forward Alyssa Smith connected the dots between the missed calls and the physicality itself, describing a feedback loop where players don't get the whistle they expect, so the physicality escalates in response, which then makes the officiating job even harder. Even outside the league, UConn's Gino Auriemma, one of the most respected voices in basketball at any level, called the WNBA's physicality a shame and said it wasn't conducive to great basketball. None of these people are talking about Caitlin Clark specifically in these quotes. That's the point. This isn't a story about one star being uniquely targeted in isolation. It's a story about a league-wide consistency problem that happens to be most visible on the player who draws the most cameras. Which is exactly why what happened next is worth paying attention to, because it shows this problem reaching a completely different team and a completely different star. The suspension that shows this isn't just about one player. In July, Toronto Tempo head coach Sandy Brondello was suspended 1 game without pay by the league. The trigger was a post-game incident during a loss to the Atlanta Dream when Toronto's Nyara Sabally was injured on a play involving Atlanta star Angel Reese, and officials assigned the foul to Sabally rather than Reese. In a heated exchange with officials afterward, Brondello referred to Reese as a protected species, a phrase Australian commentators and coaches use to describe athletes who seem to get consistently favorable treatment from officiating. The league didn't hesitate. It suspended Brondello the very next day, issuing a statement that all coaches and team personnel are expected to uphold the highest standards of professionalism and respect. Now here's why this matters for the Caitlin Clark conversation specifically, even though it has nothing directly to do with her. This shows the officiating consistency complaint isn't confined to one team, one storyline, or one media narrative built around a single player. A coach on a completely different roster, talking about a completely different star, used almost the exact same language players have been using about Clark's treatment all season, just aimed the opposite direction. If the complaint were only about Caitlin Clark getting uniquely picked on, That wouldn't explain a coach making the identical accusation about a completely different player receiving favorable whistles. That tells you the underlying issue is bigger than any single player's storyline. It's a structural consistency problem that shows up wherever the cameras happen to be pointed that week. But before you assume the data automatically backs up what every player and coach is saying, there's a wrinkle here that the league itself has pushed back on directly, and it's the part almost nobody talking about this online seems to bring up. The data the league says doesn't exist. This next part complicates the story in a way that a purely one-sided version of this narrative would conveniently leave out. According to reporting from inside the league's own officiating operations, WNBA referee operations reviewed the connection between missed calls and the wave of injuries that have hit the league in recent seasons, specifically to check whether the growing public outcry had real statistical backing. Their conclusion, relayed to reporters covering the league, was that the data did not show a link between officiating errors and the injuries players and coaches were pointing to. Think about what that actually creates. You have players across multiple teams using strikingly similar language, describing a consistency problem they feel in real time on the floor. And you have the league's own internal review process saying its data doesn't back up the specific claim that missed calls are driving injuries. Both of those things can be happening at once, and that's exactly what makes this hard to resolve cleanly. Player experience and internal league data are pointing in different directions, and neither side has fully proven their case to the other's satisfaction. That's not a reason to dismiss what players are describing. Physical wear from repeated uncalled contact doesn't have to show up as a single traceable injury event to still be real. But it is a reason to be honest that the officiating literally causes injuries isn't a settled fact, it's a contested claim, even inside the league's own walls. What isn't contested, though, is what happened to Caitlin Clark's body over the course of this season, because that part is on the injury report for anyone to check. What actually happened to her body? This season. Strip away the speculation and look only at the confirmed record. Clark exited a June 24th game against the Phoenix Mercury in the second half with what the team described as a back issue, after landing awkwardly on an opposing player's foot during a defensive closeout. She didn't return to that game. 2 days later, head coach Stephanie White announced Clark would miss the team's game against the Los Angeles Sparks, and White said at the time there was no indication of how long the absence would last, stressing that Clark's long-term health was the priority. Clark ended up missing roughly 2 weeks. She returned on July 8th against the Sparks, but on a clearly managed workload, playing only 16 minutes and acknowledging afterward that the short rotations made it hard to find any rhythm. White indicated the plan was to build her back up gradually rather than throw her straight back into full minutes. Then, on July 16th, in a game against the Golden State Valkyries, Clark absorbed a knee to the leg that went uncalled and played through what she described afterward as a quad contusion. "That hurts. The ref can't miss that," Clark said post-game. "And then I have to play with a contusion in my leg the rest of the game. It's ridiculous." It's worth being precise about the medical language here, because it matters. A contusion generally means a bruise, not a structural tear or strain, and neither Clark nor the team announced any additional missed time from that specific incident, but the pattern is still the pattern. A back injury that cost her real games in June, a deliberately limited return in early July, and then a new leg injury from an uncalled hit in the middle of that same recovery window. You don't need to inflate any of this into something it isn't to see the shape of it. A star player managing a serious back injury got hit again in the same season on a play that went uncalled, while her team was actively trying to protect her workload. Whatever you think caused the original injury, the timing of that second incident, landing right in the middle of her comeback stretch, is not a great look for a league that had just spent the offseason promising to protect freedom of movement on the floor. And here's why. The league can't just shrug this off as one player's bad luck, because the moment you start adding up what Caitlin Clark is actually worth to this business, it becomes very hard to argue that any of this is a low-stakes problem. what she is actually worth to this league. This is the part that explains why every single one of the previous sections matters so much to the people running the WNBA. Start with the tourism numbers. After Indiana drafted Clark, the city's tourism agency, Visit Indy, ran targeted advertising in Iowa to test whether her massive college fan base would actually travel to see her play as a pro. Traffic to the Fever-specific pages on Visit Indy's website jumped 501%. Fever home games started correlating directly with spikes in hotel bookings across the city. A finance professor who studies sports franchise valuation estimated Clark's presence was responsible for roughly a quarter of all WNBA economic activity in a single season, and that her arrival helped push the Fever's franchise valuation from around $90 million to somewhere between $340 and $370 million in the space of about a year. That kind of financial gravity doesn't stay abstract. It shows up in concrete, physical investment. The Fever is currently building a $78 million, 108,000 square foot practice facility in downtown Indianapolis, set to open before the 2027 season, funded privately by the team's ownership group. Team attendance jumped 320% in Clark's rookie year alone, according to Front Office Sports. Now look at what happens every time she's actually on the floor for a broadcast. The Fever's opening weekend game against the Dallas Wings this season averaged 2.49 million viewers on ABC. A later matchup against the New York Liberty on CBS averaged 2.56 million, peaking above 3 million. Across the season, ESPN and ABC's WNBA broadcasts are averaging 1.3 million viewers, up 6% from the previous record-setting year. When the Fever played on USA Network against the Toronto Tempo, the game drew 1 million viewers, the most-watched WNBA game on cable that season, up 134% from the league's average cable audience the year before, even while going head-to-head against World Cup coverage on other networks. Even the WNBA Draft, a non-game broadcast, pulled in 2.45 million viewers on ESPN, peaking near 3.1 million, the highest audience for any WNBA telecast since the year 2000. Here's the number that should really stop you. On a night when Clark was sidelined and the Fever still took the floor, their game against the Los Angeles Sparks on CBS still pulled 1.57 million viewers, and a game against the Las Vegas Aces during that same absence averaged 1.55 million on ESPN. Even without her physically playing, the Fever brand she built now carries real weight on its own. That's a double-edged fact for the league. It means Clark's absence doesn't collapse the numbers the way it might have 2 years ago, but it also proves just how completely she rebuilt this franchise's commercial identity from the ground up before anyone else got the chance to. Put all of that together, and you get the real stakes of everything covered in this video. A player generating record-setting numbers every time she's on national television, whose presence has been directly credited with hundreds of millions of dollars in franchise value and infrastructure investment, spent this season absorbing uncalled contact, racking up technical fouls for visible frustration, and eventually missing real games with a back injury that lined up with a new leg injury from another missed call. And the league's own internal data reportedly says there's no statistical link between any of that officiating and any of the injuries. So where does this actually leave the WNBA? Here's the honest, uncomfortable answer, and it's not the clean villain story some corners of the internet want to tell you. The WNBA didn't ignore this. It built a task force, changed its rules around freedom of movement, added internal grading systems for officials, and openly admitted from the commissioner down that the product had gotten too physical. That response is real, and it's more structural than a lot of leagues manage after a similar public outcry. But the response also created a new, messier problem, with foul counts spiking and games slowing down, while the players closest to the action are still using the exact same word over and over across different teams and different stars. Consistency. Not too much contact, not too little. Just no reliable pattern anyone can actually predict from game to game. And in the middle of all of it sits the player whose business impact makes every single one of these failures more expensive than it would be for almost anyone else on any WNBA roster. A player who gets fouled and doesn't get the call, gets frustrated and risks a suspension for showing it, and gets hurt in the exact window she's trying to work her way back from being hurt the first time. The task force is still meeting. The freedom of movement rules are still being adjusted in real time. Caitlin Clark is still on the floor, still generating the biggest numbers in the sport, and still waiting to see whether any of this actually changes what happens the next time she drives into the paint with a defender closing in behind her. That's the part nobody can answer yet, not the league, not the players, not the coaches building this new system as they go. Whether the freedom of movement crackdown eventually settles into something that actually protects players consistently, or whether it just becomes one more off-season promise that quietly erodes the moment the games start counting again. We'll find out together, one broadcast at a time. Let me know in the comments whether you think this officiating overhaul is actually working, or whether you think it's already starting to slip the same way it did before. And subscribe, because the next time this story moves, and it will move again before this season is over, you'll want to already be here for it.